Want to welcome everybody to today's Tesla Unwired. Hoping that we have everybody in the room now. I know we're doing multiple streams. Do we have our folks in from Facebook and YouTube along with Zoom, Deb? Very good. Want to welcome everybody. I'm excited about today's guest. We had a chance to chat just before the Tesla Science Center's gala last year, and you know, just from that conversation, there was just so much more that I wanted to learn about Dr. Kleinrock's work. And so we spent a few months getting to know Dr. Kleinrock better, and then we realized that our audience at Tesla Unwired would probably really appreciate learning the history, and especially, you know, if you like the title of today's Tesla Unwired, the day the internet went live, such an amazing opportunity to interview an icon. So before I introduce Professor Kleinrock and let him speak, I'd like to give you a little background. Professor Leonard Kleinrock is a distinguished professor of computer science at UCLA. He developed a mathematical theory of packet networks, packet radio networks, local area networks, broadband networks, nomadic computing, peer-to-peer networks, and intelligent software agents, the technology underpinning the internet, while a graduate student at MIT from 1960 to 1962. The birth of the internet occurred in the UCLA laboratory when his host computer became the first node of the internet in September 1969. It was from there that he directed the transmission of the first message to pass over the internet on October 29th, 1969, shortly after the summer of '69. The best days of our lives. I would say same year that we landed on the moon. I can't wait to hear about your perspective on that. Dr. Kleinrock received his PhD from MIT in 1963, his BEE degree from CCNY in 1957, and his MS degree from MIT in 1959. He is also the recipient of numerous honorary doctorates and awards, including the National Medal of Science, a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an IEEE Fellow, an ACM Fellow, an Informs Fellow, and an IEC Fellow. Among his many honors, he is the recipient of the Erickson Prize, the NAE Draper Prize, the Marconi Prize, the Okawa Prize, and was further recognized when he received the 2007 National Medal of Science, the highest honor for achievement in science bestowed by the President of the United States. So as we look at the relationship between Nikola Tesla and not only the history of his technology, we like to interview guests that have made a major impact on our lives. And Dr. Kleinrock, you're one of them. I want to thank you and welcome you to the program. How are you today?
Pleasure. Thanks for that very long, unnecessarily complex introduction.
Family didn't come because I don't want to have to entertain them, and I don't want to be.
So, in an interview with the New York Times in 1909, Tesla said it would soon be possible, for instance, for a businessman in New York to dictate instructions and have them appear in type in London or elsewhere. He'll be able to call from his desk and talk with any telephone subscriber in the world. It will only be necessary to carry an inexpensive instrument no bigger than a watch, which will enable its bearer to hear anywhere on sea or land for distances of thousands of miles. So Tesla Science Center, for those of you joining us today, we were able to save Nikola Tesla's last standing laboratory. This comment was around the time that he was at the laboratory. And when he said it, a lot of people didn't realize that actually could be reality. They thought he was out of his mind. Many of the times the predictions he made, he was ahead of his time. Dr. Kleinrock, when you were working on your thesis, were people grasping what you were getting at? Was this, what were those early days like?
You're exactly right. Nobody was interested in networking. The reason I chose the topic is exactly that, because nobody else was working on it. And it was clearly a research project which would have impact, which was in some sense full of low-hanging fruit because it was unmined, and I had an approach. So it was not a topic of great excitement or real interest. In fact, MIT never really picked up the ball on networking. They were focused on things like information theory, time sharing, critical technologies, but networking was not on their agenda, nor on the agenda of industry. AT&T said the technology wouldn't work. And even if it did, they wanted nothing to do with it. And we met complete resistance all along the way. So it wasn't until the US government needed a network to connect together their research computers that it became something which in fact could be realized.
And now, in past conversations, you're talking about, some of the elements that led to the innovation in this space. One part of it was the space race. Would you say that, the underpinnings of what led to the work that you were doing and many of your colleagues at MIT, was it the space race, or was there something even before that germinated the networking, and then the space race added the accelerant, the funding to try to pull this together?
It was the environment. You mentioned MIT. MIT in those days, in the 50s and 60s, was a world unto itself. And it was constantly looking inward to their own researches, their own development, and not looking outward. I mean, the West Coast was irrelevant to the East Coast MIT world, for example. But within that world, we had a collection of brilliant, energetic, exciting people, all pursuing research in which they were really dedicated and interested, and the faculty was superb. So that environment was a kind of golden age, where, for example, if you and I were students there at the same time, graduate students, you'd spend time in my office, in my bullpen, if you will, sharing your ideas with me and vice versa. And we'd hone each other and listen and critique. It was basically an environment of constant curiosity, refinement, and discovery, driven by, of course, the element that makes it all work, curiosity. We all came up out of a world of scientific curiosity. Why does this behave the way it does? How come it's not doing the following thing? And a kind of collective search for why things work the way they did. So it wasn't so much the space race. Yes, the space race helped because, in fact, before that, we had the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58. That's what led to Sputnik. Sputnik led to a massive growth in technology funding from President Eisenhower when he formed the Advanced Research Projects Agency. So there was an agreement, a spirit of STEM ideas, well-funded, with people dedicated to discovering new things, with or without impact, by the way. The curiosity, just trying to research something which was interesting, drove a lot of us together. So the space race itself helped because it was a manifestation of the commitment of the United States to fund science, technology, engineering, and math. And yes, MIT was a recipient of that. In fact, the money that came to the MIT researchers was what was called a tri-services contract. It wasn't a single entity. It wasn't DARPA, for example, or ARPA. It was a general fund which the university, the institute, could use any way they wanted. And so they could fund the ideas that were germinating and popping up and bubbling up on their own.
How difficult was it a grant process when you were trying to obtain funding for this type of research back then? Because think of the researchers I work with now at universities, and they're writing grants to NIH or a various number of federal agencies, and it's a pretty competitive process. But billions does get allocated. But was it an onerous grant process then? I'm assuming you didn't have SAMS.gov and all these other items that you have to make sure that all the passwords are the internet wasn't invented yet. But what was that process like in trying to get funding for this kind of research?
It was completely the opposite. It wasn't even something as students, we were not asked to participate in getting funding. The funding at the university, at MIT, for example, was available in that tri-services contract I happened to get a important scholarship from MIT Lincoln Laboratory, but all the students were funded one way or another, and it was not on our mind. We didn't write proposals. We didn't have basically meetings to show our goods off to the government or to the funding agencies. And the concept there was when ARPA was formed in 1958, the idea was, as I said, to react to Sputnik, recognizing that the United States had dropped. We were no longer number one in technology. So Eisenhower started funding research projects through ARPA to bring the level of capability up. It wasn't in response to a nuclear threat. It wasn't with a particular goal in mind. There was no military application in mind, just to make you and me and other young people and professionals increase their capability. So as a result, how is the money from government, from ARPA, deployed? How is it from the Army, the Navy, the Air Force? And the answer is, it was done very undemocratically. It was not a competitive process. And that was part of the secret and the beauty of the way ARPA chose their researchers. They'd go, for example, if Tesla were alive at the time, they'd go to Tesla and they say, look, we know you're a great researcher, a brilliant mind. Here's a pile of money. Go do something great. Reach for the moon. Shoot high. High impact, high risk, high payoff. Failure's okay. We're going to give you this money for a long time because we know you're good. You've proven it. And, just go do something. We won't bother you. Do it the way you want. So they found people that they uncompetitively, but by knowledge and reputation and experience, said, you're good, go do it. And that was an amazing process. It produced all the things you've mentioned time sharing, networking, chip technology, speech technology, graphics, and all the rest, on and on and on. So that was a very uncompetitive, but in those days, very effective way to do funding. So the answer to the question is, no, we did not have to reach out for funding. It was not on the agenda, certainly not of the students or even of the professors. The school made sure there was enough funding to support the great ideas that were bubbling up.
So I appreciate that. So what got you interested? So you're at the university, and what made you realize that this was an important course of study, that this was your trajectory? What inspired you?
Well, there's two answers to that question. How I got into engineering in the first place, that's one question. But what I did at MIT, as I said, I had this wonderful scholarship from MIT Lincoln Lab to get a master's degree. And I was pursuing that, and I was about to finish it. I was married. I scheduled my first child to be born just when I finished the master's. I'd have an excellent research position at MIT. Life was fine, ready to go. And the answer to the question is, what motivated me? They twisted my arm. They said, you've got to get a PhD. I said, I don't want a PhD. I'm happy. I'm going to do research at MIT. They said, no, you have to do it. And I was not set to get a PhD at all. 3-4 years of dedication with a child about to be born was not where I wanted to be. But they pursued it so hard that I decided, yeah, I'll do it. And I had two conditions. Condition number one was I wanted to work for the absolutely best professor at MIT. And secondly, in partial answer to the question, I wanted to do something which would have impact. I looked at my classmates, and many of them are working on very hard, small, follow-on problems to some earlier research, which I felt were hard and probably wouldn't have a lot of impact. So I decided, no, that's not what I wanted to do. So the answer is, my arm was twisted.
Right.
And I entered the program.
So now I do want to go and hit the rewind button and find out what made you interested in becoming an engineer.
A comic book.
Okay.
I was early in elementary school, and I loved comics and gadgets and sports and all the rest that young people do living in a place like New York City. New York City is a wonderful place to grow up there. Either you survive or you don't on the streets. And besides that, you you get to find all kinds of activities, if not only sports, but experiments, other people doing things. And in this comic book, I love reading comic books, Superman comic book, in the centerfold was a description of something called how to build a crystal radio, whatever the heck that was. But it said you could build it with parts you can find around the house. And once you do it, you'll be able to hear music and you could tune a radio. I said, oh, that looks interesting. So what did I need? Well, I needed an empty toilet paper roll. I could find that. I needed some wire on this. I went out on the street and found some wire in this gutter, make a coil. I needed my father's old razor blade that he had discarded and a pencil lead to make a crystal. I needed an earphone, and I certainly had no earphone in the house, but I knew in the candy store down the street, there was a telephone booth. And in the telephone booth was a telephone that had a handset. And I realized you could unscrew the earpiece and steal the damn thing. So I stole the earpiece. And the last piece I needed was a variable capacitor, whatever that was. I knew that I couldn't find on the street. So I had my mother take me down on the subway to Cortlandt Street, where all the radio stores were. I walked up to the first store and I said, I need a variable capacitor. It's little kids asking me, I need a variable capacitor. And the clerk behind the counter said, fine, what size do you need? I had no idea. It blew my cover. I explained what I wanted. He gave me exactly the right part, cost a nickel, brought it home, turned it on, and I could tune in music and radio stations. And that's what ensnared me. I mean, this was magic. This was something I had no idea how it worked. I built it for nothing, basically. And I spent the rest of my life trying to figure out how it does work. And I wish Tesla was here to explain it to me. No, that's a joke. But the point is, any action at a distance, like electromagnetism, like the world of Tesla, is magic. Right. It's you don't see it, you can't feel it, you can watch it behave. So that got me started. Of course, the seeds were there. I was a kid who loved to build things, model airplanes and all the rest. And so I was interested in playing around with things. For me, they were toys, but of course they were big lessons. And there were lessons in science.
That's great. That was great.
That was the start, and of course it followed from there.
Yeah. So you knew at a very young age from that experience, though, that you wanted to be an inventor. You wanted to be an engineer. You wanted to create.
Well, you said that more or less right. I didn't know what an engineer was. I wanted to play with toys and build things. And in fact, I was not committed to be an engineer, or even a scientist as a young man. I got into Bronx High School of Science in New York. And I was a little concerned that that would force me into the science direction. But I went anyway. And one of the first classes I took was a social studies class. I was relieved, okay, there'd be a little culture here, something beyond science. And the first thing the teacher said is, we're going to study social studies using the scientific method. I said, oh God, that's not what I want. I want a little more breadth. But it was a great experience. And slowly I moved into that. You know, after I built that radio, I wanted to build more sophisticated ones. So I started cannibalizing all the broken radios in the neighborhood and taking the tubes and the capacitors and the resistors and the inductors and putting together new radios. So I was busy building things and experimenting on my own with a little bit of instruction. Finally, I started reading more sophisticated materials and manuals. But it was just playing around. It was, and to be honest, that's still what drives me. You know, I like to choose the things that excite me, interest me, and you know, not necessarily going to be of use in industry or productivity, but why does it work that way? Right. Can I improve it? Can I build the damn thing? And then can I understand how it works?
Well, as a science and just beginning our STEM programming, you're highlighting what excites us and we think is an important part of what we can do, and it's invention education. And again, to inspire kids in small doses at young ages that they can fulfill that curiosity. They have a hands-on experience and invent or create, and just let them know that this is a possibility. When I thought of the sciences, I thought of test tubes and beakers, and that was not exciting to me. But the electrical engineering side, and if there's a way that we can show kids at an early age all the disciplines of the sciences and engineering, they may choose that path. And not always, like you said, it doesn't always have to have that market, commercialization aspect. We do think it's important that in our STEM programming, we'll layer in a big portion of entrepreneurship, because one of the criticisms of Tesla was he was a great inventor. He didn't care about business all that much. He was more into the invention piece, and could he have commercialized more? And so it's important that young inventors understand the commercialization aspect, but the purity of invention and creation is a beautiful thing as well, and doesn't always have.
There's an interesting intermediate step between those two approaches. One, the pure joy of building something, the other one of deploying it. And that's the step where others use what you've discovered or created. It's not an entrepreneurial business orientation, it's a gratification. If I build something and you like it, and you use it, and you develop it, that's a wonderful feeling. And forms a community. That then, of course, leads to where you're talking about. It eventually leads to a product where many more people can gain access to it. But it's an important step, from the pure science, just to go to the money motivation is, I think that intermediate step is important. You're doing it for a reason, because other people will benefit from it. They'll enjoy it. They'll appreciate it. You feel good about it.
Okay. So, your thesis is based on networking and the underpinnings of the internet. And then you're a professor at UCLA, right? And you build a team, and that's how we met, through one of your students, Vint Cerf, who ironically I had seen Vint speak before, and I was in awe of all the work that he's done, and what he's doing now at Google. But it was actually a story that I heard that Larry Page at Google became an engineer because he read Tesla biography. So I told a friend of mine, I want to meet Larry Page. And he said, well, I know Vint Cerf, and let me make an introduction, because he knows Larry Page. I still haven't met Larry Page yet, so I'll have to ask Vint for that introduction, because I got so enamored with actually, getting to know Vint Cerf. And then he told me about, the work with your team. So once you start, building this team of engineers, did you know exactly where this would go, or what was the goal when you were originally getting ready to flip the switch of the day the internet went live? And I'm going to ask you separately about that, but what was the goal as you were building it?
So there were two threads, in a sense. The first thread was the pure research on the networking. As you say, I left MIT, came to UCLA. Nobody was interested in networking. Basically, none of my colleagues were. And so I continued to pursue the research on my own with some PhD students along the way. But there was no driver except the research content, the research curiosity, the research challenges. The second thread was, again, from ARPA. As ARPA was formed in 58 and 62, the Computer Office was created, the Information Processing Techniques Office. And they started funding people, like I said before. They'd give a pile of money to researchers at various universities and said, go do something great. And lots of good things came out. So these centers of excellence in various disciplines in computer science began to appear, and in electrical engineering. And in the mid-60s, it was obvious that all these centers of excellence could benefit if they could access each other's capabilities, their resources, their computers, their software, their applications, etc. And so it was determined at ARPA that a network is the way to connect these things together, a data network whereby computers could exchange information. And so the drive for a physical network bubbled up within ARPA. And so on the one hand, we were doing research for the scientific side. On the other hand, there was a driving need now to actually create a network. And what could be better? Here I was isolated in some kind of a desert, pursuing the network and research. Nobody cared about it. Nobody was pushing it. And suddenly there's a demand for implementing this darn thing. So I couldn't be happier. I mean, here was a chance to actually test this network in a real deployed situation. So that's really what, I began to get involved with ARPA. They brought in one of my classmates from MIT to be the chief scientist of the project. And he brought together some of the people he knew, including myself. Larry Roberts, it was his name. He was a classmate and office mate of mine, in fact. And he was very well aware of the work I had done on the modeling mathematical structure of the data networking. And so he brought me into that team. And so plans began to develop to build this network. And that's when it was decided that UCLA would be the first node on the network, because we had the theoretical and the mathematical understanding as to how this network should work. So we became what's called the Network Measurement Center. It was our job to test the network, to try to break it, to see what the outer limits were. And so I had to put together a team, software, hardware, theoretical team to make all this happen. So I began to do that at UCLA. And with funding that came from ARPA.
That's had to be a very exciting time. So tell me about the day that the internet went live. I don't know if you should tell me the name of the person who flipped the switch, just because you don't want to terminate it to come back in time one day to stop that person. But hopefully we're not going there. I think we're going in the right direction. But I know a lot of people are concerned with the past couple of years of the internet. But that day, what was it like when it got turned on? Is there an actual switch, and were you the person that turned on the internet, or how did that work?
So let's understand why the network was created. It was created, as I said before, so that I at UCLA could log on to a machine in your location, which had a special resource I wanted, maybe graphics or some expertise. That means from one site, I should be able to log in through the network to a remote machine as if I was a local user at your facility, and then use your computer and your services. So in order to test that functionality, sit at one machine, log on to the network as if you're a local user on a remote network, we needed at least two nodes, a local and a remote. So by the time we had two nodes on the network, UCLA was brought on in September 1969. Stanford Research Institute up in Menlo Park, basically 350 miles to the north of UCLA, was brought in October of 1969. And toward the end of that month, they had connected their switch to their host computer, the machine which had the services. Down at our end, we had connected our host computer to our switch. And there was a high-speed line between the two. A high-speed line running at a blazing speed of 50,000 bits per second, which was very fast at that time. And so we wanted to test it. So we decided that we're going to try to log in from UCLA to SRI, Stanford Research Institute. So down at my end, I had one of my programmers, Charlie Klein, a student programmer. Up at the other end, they had one of their programmers, a fellow named Bill Duval. And they're set up to send a message. Well, the message was simply to log in from UCLA to SRI. Now, to log in, you have to type LOG. And the SRI machine is smart enough to know what you're trying to do. It's going to type the IN field. So the attempt was to log in. So Charlie got ready to type LOG, but we weren't sure if this is going to work. And what is this thing called packet switching? We don't know. How do you see packets? So how do we know it's working? Well, to be sure, we set up a telephone connection between UCLA and SRI through the high-speed data line. Now look at the irony here. We're using a telephone network to develop and create a new technology, which is going to destroy the telephone network. And in fact, the irony wasn't apparent to us at the time. So Charlie typed the L, and he asked Bill, "Do you get the L?" Bill said, "Yep, got the L." And the character appeared on Charlie's terminal. Charlie typed the O, get the O? Yep, got the O. Type the G, you get the G, crash. So what was the first message you asked on the internet? It was low, as in lo and behold. I added that later. But and within an hour, we had fixed that fault that caused SRI to crash, and we had a full-blown connection going. So it was just almost nobody around, no camera, no tape recorder, a small entry in a logbook. Went home after that, went to sleep. It was just one step in the experiment of trying to test out the technology.
Right.
And in fact, we did. So it wasn't anything that looked like a dramatic event. There was nobody around to watch it. It was just another day's work in another step to deploying this new technology.
Okay. Now, that was node 1 to node 2. When did node 3 come on and node 4? Was it one at a time, or did you start adding a whole lot more very quickly?
So the original contract was given out to industry to deploy this network. We created the spec at ARPA, sent it out to industry. A company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman won the contract to deploy these networks. So they put the first switch at UCLA. And the idea was it was a 19-node network they were going to deploy across the United States. The idea was deploy the first 4 nodes, stop, test the heck out of it, and if it works, then continue. So September 69, UCLA, number 1. October 69, SRI, number 2. November 69, UC Santa Barbara, again in California, number 3. And the 4th was University of Utah, number 4 in December 69. And then we stopped for 3 months. We beat the heck out of that 4-node network. We found faults, logic faults, algorithmic faults, hardware faults, helped BBN repair those. And then beginning again in March, we began to deploy. By the summer of 1970, we had 10 nodes. And we had lines crossing the United States, 2 cross-country lines. So it began to grow into what we now know, the internet. But it started very humbly at 50,000 bits per second, which is a joke these days. And a small number of nodes, almost nobody using it. There was very little use in those early days, but it was the beginning.
And then came Al Gore, or so I say that as a wisecrack, but
It was a wisecrack.
but that being said, when I toured the Computer History Museum in California, I think there was a little piece there that some of the folks on your team said yes, that the funding that to commercialize, to take it from the research realm in the 80s and early 90s to the commercial realm where it changed our lives with email. That was an investment that Al Gore and others had pushed through Congress because they saw the important work that you did and that it would translate or transform our business. Is that, do I have that accurately, or maybe we could put that issue to bed?
Well, you did it just right, because you did raise the Al Gore issue, which is always abused, frankly,
right.
and you corrected it. In the 80s, Al Gore was the most informed, most knowledgeable senator about the internet. He came to many of our meetings. He was well up on the technology, the understanding, the implications, and he supported our work in Congress. In 1988, I chaired a committee that wrote the first report for a group called the Computer Communication Science and Technology Board as part of the National Research Council. And this report was called Towards a National Research Network. And Al Gore was so impressed by it, he asked me to testify in front of one of his Senate subcommittees. And I did. And as you say, he took that concept, and out of that came the information superhighway. The idea was he was responsible in a very positive way for taking the fledgling network that we had. It was already fairly powerful, but it didn't have a high-speed backbone. And he made sure through the High Performance Computing and Communications Act of 1991 that the first President Bush signed into law to deploy a gigabit backbone network. Al Gore called the information superhighway. It was part of the national information infrastructure. And that, you're right, that made the network capable of supporting the commercial world. There's a little history behind this, though. In those early days of those 4 nodes, 8 nodes, 10 nodes that we talked about, who was using the network? Well, first of all, there was very little use because it was very hard to use. And there was no real driver except to play around and do some research. And the people who were doing this were computer scientists. Those were the people being supported by ARPA. In the early 80s, the National Science Foundation began to deploy some supercomputers around the country. And in the mid 80s, NSF decided they wanted to connect these computers together so they could communicate and share resources, data, processing. And what better network than the internet that was beginning to be realized at that time? So NSF took charge in many ways of the internet backbone, and they created the NSF net, which was an upgrade of the ARPANET, then called the internet. And as that happened, NSF, in a brilliant move, had a very relaxed, acceptable user policy. Who could use this network? And they were fairly relaxed about it. They said anybody with any reason, any good reason, can use it. And so our world expanded well beyond computer scientists and introduced all kinds of scientists, National Science Foundation, physicists, chemists, biologists, meteorologists, oceanographers, etc. Now, where did these people work? Well, they work in universities and research labs. Where does a chemist work? Many of them work in chemical companies in the research department. And what are they doing? You said it, email. Email was the hot application of the internet in those years. Now imagine this, you got a laboratory full of people using email. And surrounding them are the developers, the salespeople, the manufacturers in these chemical plants. And they said, wow, that looks pretty nice. We'd like access to email also. So the notion of this email, this internet functionality, leaked out from the research department into the corporation. And that's when you begin to see the dot-coms appear. So suddenly there was a drive, as you suggested, to bring in the outer world. But there was no capability to support the outer world. In steps Al Gore. He provides the capability through the gigabit backbone. There's still a missing element, though. The missing element is, this is a damn complex interface to work with. You know, green screens, all kinds of characters. I mean, we still have that today. I mean, where did HTTP:// come from? I mean, why do you, and why does the average citizen have to worry about that? That's a remnant of the nerdy technology that we were faced with in the late 80s, early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
What happened? In comes the web. The web was a simple, user-friendly graphical interface. And so we had the people that wanted it, the capability in the backbone, and now a way to access it easily. And that really accelerated the deployment and the usability of this network into the consumer world. And some really strange things happened at that point. But we can pause on that. I answered your question, I think.
I definitely
brought up Al Gore.
I want to get to some of those things. The people that were clamoring for emails, little did they know we were going to get 500, 600 emails a day, and there's going to change our brain chemistry. But we'll definitely get to that. I want to pause for a second, and your work, led the way for what we're doing today. Obviously, there's a lot of work laid on top of the foundation of what you and the team had done. But today, the last time I checked, we had just about 300 people watching our podcast today from 11 different countries and 25 different states. And I'm sure those numbers crept up over the past 45 minutes. But so I want to take at least one question from the crowd, and we'll take more a little bit later. But Alfonso Flores asked, in those early days, were there thoughts on data transfer bottlenecking? And if so, what was the packet size that was a concern?
Okay, that's a nice technical question. My research was focused on exactly that kind of issue. What was the throughput? What was the response time? What was the buffer occupancy? What was the efficiency? And so my early research at MIT addressed many of those questions, but dealing with bottlenecks, deadlocks, degradations, lockups was what we learned as we deployed the network. I mean, the kinds of things that would lock up a network were because of algorithmic failures or unseen situations where buffers were being overused, couldn't release data when new data was coming in, crash. So we did a lot of theoretical work, a lot of experimental work, a lot of testing, a lot of stressing of the network to look into that issue, which is largely about what I like to call flow control. Flow control worries about congestion control, how to make sure the network doesn't move into a domain where it's going to collapse due to buffers overflowing, delays getting too large, links not being able to carry the traffic. So there was a lot of work, that was a lot of the theoretical work, a little bit of the experimental work. And eventually when some of the commercial organizations came online, like the Ciscos of the world, they were faced with that problem in their routers, and they continued to look into those issues. But the fundamentals were basically looked at earlier, and to be honest with you, those problems still exist. Networks can crash. There are situations we haven't yet encountered, which will take the network down, I guarantee. We don't know what they are, but because of the way these control mechanisms have been deployed in our network, just renders them liable for crash. And the reason is, if you put in some kind of a congestion control somewhere in the network, then somebody adds a new device and they put in their own congestion control, and the third and the fourth and the fifth. And these control mechanisms don't necessarily know nor care about the other mechanisms that exist. And they can interact in very explosive ways. And we've seen a number of those in the past. Well, I'm sure there's plenty left. So with that encouraging sense, that's the basic answer to the question. It was looked at very early, and it's still an ongoing area of research and observation.
Now, also, many of us have gotten to know Vint Cerf well, and he was one of your students. So tell me, where in this timeline did Vint enter and do some of his work with the TCP and IP protocols?
Okay, so in those early days, I put together this team. Vint was among them. John Pastel was among them. Steve Crocker. In fact, I had to put together a software group, a hardware group, a theoretical group, and a staff. And some of them were already working for another colleague of mine, a Professor Jerry Estrin, working on some computer performance evaluation teams. When I received the ARPA contract, many of them moved over to work with me. And there already was a software team with Steve Crocker in charge of it, Vint working under him, John Pastel, Bill Naylor, etc. So Vint was busy working on some of the software to implement the IMP host protocol, this router host protocol, even before we deployed the network, as our job was to allow the IMP to talk to the hosts. He continued at UCLA till he got his degree. I was on his committee. He then went up to Stanford University. There he worked with some of his own students. But meanwhile, Bob Kahn, who was at both Beranek and Newman, who was the company that deployed the network in terms of choosing the mini computer and leasing the lines from AT&T, Bob Kahn and he got to know each other. And in 1972 or so, they began to recognize that as different networks attached to the ARPANET, they had to exchange protocol information. They had to match each other's protocol. So each time a new network came on, each of the other networks had to have an interface to the new protocol. And this was clearly going to become an untenable problem. So Vint and Bob then jointly, with some students, developed the concept of transmission control protocol. And out of that came TCP and IP, Internet Protocol. And then they deployed that. So is that enough of the story? You want some more details?
No, that's
Yeah.
really helpful. I know, you know, I saw some kind of documentary. It was made years ago where they talked about how TCP and IP really sped up and also let you know that your message got there. Like you said with that first message, you had to make that phone call. Now you had the confirmation that the email was sent. Am I correct on that? Or
Yes, but let's look at the protocols. The protocol before TCP was called NCP, Network Control Protocol. That was what was originally deployed with that software team. Vint was on it, Steve was on it. They created the host-to-host protocol, which allowed hosts to communicate. And there was end-to-end control. There was something called a RFM. You had to bark it, an RFNM. It meant request for next message. So in a process-to-process communication, you would send a message, and you couldn't send another one until you got the request for the next message. So there was end-to-end acknowledgement that the message had arrived. But the thing that the brilliant work of Vint and Bob was to allow this single protocol, this TCP protocol, to be used by everybody. So all you as a new technology coming into the network, you'd have to match TCP. You wouldn't have to match 100 other network protocols. And so by doing that, they had a common language, which allowed TCP to develop. And in fact, it did its own end-to-end acknowledgement, error correction, and all the rest. And TCP was the end-to-end protocol, by the way. IP was the hop-by-hop protocol, the internet in protocol, if you will. And it took hold, and it was a very significant improvement over the NCP. But the NCP did allow multiple networks to intercommunicate. We had not only the ARPANET, we had AlohaNet, we had the satellite network, and they were able to implement before TCP came on. But TCP greatly streamlined the process and allowed growth in a significant way.
got it. So, you know, in retrospect, and then I want to talk about some thought of where this will all go. But over the years, as you've watched the internet grow in use and new applications, what applications made you giddy, and then which ones made you cringe?
Okay, so to answer that, let me preface it with the following. Email, when it came in 1972, was a total surprise. Nobody anticipated it. And as soon as it was deployed, within months, it took over 3/4 of the network traffic. It was a surprise, unanticipated, and explosive. Well, that's been the history of the applications, the hot user applications for the entire history of the internet. We didn't anticipate YouTube. We didn't anticipate peer-to-peer. We didn't anticipate search. We didn't anticipate social networking, Facebook, any of those. And as they came on, each one of them, in question of months, just began to dominate the network. Each one of them became the flavor of the month. Hot stuff. Email was clearly, in my mind, the most surprising and significant application. It was the first big one. And I say that because I remember as a professor with my students, we'd be working on research for the network technology. And I remember one day walking into the bullpen where all the graduate students were sitting. And I looked at them and they were all busy doing some damn thing or other. And I looked over the shoulder of one of them and was talking about photography. Another one was talking about cooking. I said, look, this is not network research. They were involved in basically news groups, those early implementations of a social network. And they were exchanging, using using email to exchange information.
Right.
So I realized at that point that this is not about computers talking to each other. It's about people communicating and forming groups of common interest. And that was a huge revelation because, you know, I had anticipated what the network might be months before the network was deployed. And I had a vision, which I can articulate if you like, but I totally missed the social networking side. Totally missed it. And it was email that made it clear. That's what it was all about.
What was the original vision that you had?
So the original vision was literally 2 months before the first switch was deployed. And I'll paraphrase, I can send you a copy of it if you like.
Sure.
I'll paraphrase it by saying, I'd said, this network will be always on, always available. Anybody with any device can get it at any time, and it will be invisible. And by invisible, I meant it will be as invisible as electricity is to you today. Electricity is a very sophisticated technology in the infrastructure. It's a hole in the wall. You plug in, you get this thing called electricity. No big interface, no password, no coding, no tiny keyboard, no tiny screen. It's a very simple, it's invisible to you. And this internet capability, this networking capability, will be invisible in that same sense. It'll be disappearing to the infrastructure. You'll be able to access all the services as simply as you and I are talking right now. And that's not yet happened, by the way. It's on the way, but the invisibility, but the others have happened.
Right.
It's everywhere. It's always on. It's any device, any place, anytime.
Well, you know, what you're touching on is something that keeps popping up in my mind, and it's that we are so connected now that you're starting to be able to see. I hate to put it this way, but the neurosis of the crowd, but the ebb and flow, what patterns of segments of the population, and it's become a whole lot easier with smartphones as opposed to being in front of your computer. People are on it. It's addictive, but almost like a group think. You have to kind of disassociate yourself from a little bit from the internet, have your own thought process, and then plug back in. What has concerned you? What do you think we need to protect ourselves from with some of the dangers we've seen in the misuse of the internet and the spread of misinformation?
So that question goes in with the other half of the question you asked a moment ago. What frightened me? What concerned me about the internet? And 1988, the first worm appeared. Robert Morris released a worm, and it spread to a moderately large portion of the internet, and it began to cause some nuisance. And the network is relatively small, and we saw that. We said, "Uh-oh," and then we said, "Oh well, little aberration, some graduate students playing around." What a mistake! That was the harbinger of some of the bad things you just mentioned. Fast forward 6 more years later, 1994, the first broad-based spam message appeared. April 12th, 1994, 2 lawyers sent out an email to almost everybody on the net. And I can show you a copy of it one day. I've got a copy of that original email. And it basically said, there's a green card lottery about to be deployed. Come to us, lawyers, and we'll help you get onto the lottery. And by the way, pay us. This was an internet advertisement on our experimental network. How dare they? This is not a commercial. This is a research network. So we sent email back to them. We said, stop, desist. You can't do this. Shame on you. Get out of here. We sent so much email back to them that we took down their server. So by an unintended consequence of the first spam message, we created the first denial of service attack. Unintended. But the cat was now out of the bag. It was now clear to the commercial world that this thing called the internet was a wonderful advertising machine. It was a shopping mall. It was a gossip chamber. It was an entertainment hall. And so the focus shifted from science, technology, experiment, research, to the consumer world, what was driving was not investigation and technology, it was commerce. It was profit motive. And so the big corporations came in and began to deploy advertising. They began to sell their wares on the internet. And that totally changed the character of the internet to lead to some of the things you mentioned a moment ago. In fact, it brought in the consumer. Once you bring in the consumer, which is fine, you're bringing in all the people who want to exploit the consumer, sell to them, exploit them, etc. And so the dark side of the internet began to emerge. And we can spend a long time talking about that. I'm happy to do it. But in my mind, that's when it started to appear. And it's grown ever since to extreme conditions. You know, we used to think of hackers and even advertising as a nuisance. Okay, you know, the internet is going through a phase. It's in its in its juvenile years. It'll grow up. But that's no longer my view. My view now is that it's dangerous. There are nation states playing this game, organized crime, serious contenders that have a serious impact on where the internet is going and what it might be able to do or not do. So I am concerned.
It's, you know, and it's I as you spoke, I vacillated between two thought patterns. It's the perpetration of some evil on an individual on the internet by sending them a phishing email, luring them to a site that steals their data. That's horrible. And then you're talking about those actors that are able to almost take down nations and change an entire population's mind with misinformation and curating what they see. And there definitely needs to be a code of ethics. Don't know who would enforce it, but yeah, there's an enormous amount of opportunity and an enormous amount of issues that arise. But what do you foresee the future looking like? You know, from the internet. Do you subscribe to the idea that we're going to have implantables similar to like NeuroNet that Elon Musk talks about, where we'll have AI algorithms that make us these superhuman cognitive beings who can share information almost instantaneously? You see that happening? Is that a good thing, or where do you see this going?
So when you ask about where do I see the internet going, you're really asking two questions. You're asking what will be the infrastructure, the technology on the one hand, and what will be the uses and the applications on the other. I said a few minutes ago, the uses and the applications, we've been terrible at predicting. And I suspect we will continue to be surprised by how it's used. The technology, and I'll come back to some of that in a moment, but the technology, it's fairly clear. You've mentioned some of it already. I see, to get to the bottom line, there will be a global intelligence, a wired planet where the technology will be everywhere. It'll be pervasive global internet, and an invisible one deployed into the infrastructure, be it the walls, your fingernails, your bodies, your desk, your cars, etc. And you'll be able to interact with it the way you and I are interacting right now, by voice, by sight, by gestures, if we're close to each other, by haptics, in a natural way, without a tiny keyboard, with a tiny screen, with protocols, with the HTTP:// with passwords and all the rest. It'll be a far more natural. So that sounds like a wonderful world to be in, putting aside the issue of privacy. A very simple world, and I believe that's going to happen. Technology is being deployed, and as you mentioned, the brain-computer interface is already being deployed. We know that people can move their prosthetic limbs just by thinking about it, and that's happening. How deep they go is yet to be seen. You know that Eric Schmidt and his wife just donated $150 million to the Broad Institute at MIT and Harvard to study exactly neurological and computer interface issues. So that's moving ahead very strongly. But in terms of the applications, it's very hard to predict what they're going to be. And we've seen some of the applications already, some of the negative applications, as you said, fake information, influencing by nation states, fake news on the network, shaming on the network, influence on the network, nonsense on the network, which is not as bad, by the way. But this issue of AI, see, I believe not only is the internet going to become invisible through deploying it into the infrastructure, using things like embedded technology, IoT, but the other thing that supports that kind of invisibility into the infrastructure are intelligent software agents, personalized to your use. Those software agents know what you want. They provide information for you of interest, perhaps. How much they control what you do is a whole other and separate and difficult issue. But if you want to be, you already have it. You have alerts in the system right now that tell you when certain things happen that you prefer to know about. So these intelligent, personalized software agents are part of that invisibility. They're out there sorting things, gathering things for you. But in terms of your privacy on the one hand and the influence on the other, are where the danger comes in. In terms of privacy, you gave up your privacy a long time ago. When you put your phone number in the telephone directory, you gave up some of your privacy. When you use a credit card, they know exactly what you ate, where you ate it, when, and how much you paid. When you walk around with a smartphone, you're allowing yourself to be tracked. That the cell towers do it, and the people who want the information can do it. So in some sense, your privacy is gone. Now we can put certain controls on it, but in my mind, the only real way to have privacy is to go to the edge of the ocean, here, say in Santa Monica, strip down, dive in, and hope there's no sonar down there, and there will be tracking you. So now that's a very negative view. There are certain rights we should be able to express. And the example I like to use is the following. When's the last time Google or Facebook asked you, what privacy policy would you like us to apply to you? When do you get to express what you want? Right. You don't, by and large. And it should be possible. You should be able to articulate very carefully. You don't want them to go into your contact database. You may allow them to watch where you bought food. You may be willing to give up your email address for information. You can articulate that in this kind of graphical way. There are ways to do that. And the vendor should be able to say, here's what we're doing to you. And you look at it and say, it either matches or doesn't match. If it doesn't match, you negotiate with them. And if you don't like what they do, you can walk, because it's hard to walk from Facebook. By the way, I have no trouble walking from Facebook. I'm not on Facebook.
Right.
But the point, and they may argue, well, look, we can't give a customized interface to everybody. And my answer is baloney. They already do. How did those customized ads find their way into your web experience? So they could do it. And so it's a question of getting not only the corporations and the providers to allow this to happen, it's you, the public, who have to express your outrage at this. Right now, most of the public is fairly passive about these things. They expect somehow technology to solve it. Unless they express themselves and demand it, it's not going to happen. So privacy is an issue, but there's also the danger, the nefarious stuff you mentioned, it, phishing is an example, corruption, mind influeing, etc.
Right.
I haven't really answered your question about the Musk idea of the neuro computer issue, and that's a hard one. Yeah. It's happening. They can observe certain actions that you take or desire to take, but can they read your mind? Will they be able to read your mind? I mean, there are some things that you really want to keep private. I'll give you a homely example. When you're out in public and you're introduced to somebody, humans very often make an immediate judgment. I like that person. I don't like that person. They've got a pimple on their forehead that's really quite ugly. Now, you wouldn't want that to be exposed. Those are very private thoughts.
Right.
Well, is there a boundary that we can set up now to prevent those things from being penetrated? We should certainly be looking into it. How to do that, I don't know, but it is an issue as an important one, and there is no solution to that right now. There's no effective solution to that now.
So it could be a whole new field of study, though, for some of the students coming up today. That
Yeah.
you know, the guidelines, the policies. So those even going through the political science realm and going into government, they should not be completely ignorant to the issues surrounding the internet. Because at the same time, if they're ignorant, not only will they not deal with the issues correctly, but they could create more problems than you know, than was intended.
You're
So
exactly right. To one, you might say to me, you might challenge me, how come the internet is so leaky and hasn't built-in mechanisms to protect us against this? And the answer is, first of all, is mea culpa. But secondly, when we started this network, as I said, it was a bunch of scientists, engineers trying to solve a technical problem. And the challenge was the engineering, the science. And none of us were thinking of taking out patents on this idea or owning the idea or monetizing the idea. We were a bunch of nerds having a lot of fun building and solving a challenging problem. I mean, I knew everybody on the internet in those early days. They were my friends, and they were all well behaved. They obeyed, if you will, something called netiquette. It was an netiquette. It was an open, free, shared, ethical, supportive network. And so we did not build in any protections against nefarious behavior. Foolishly, idealistically, there was no need. And we could have built in some things early on. At least two things we could have done, which would have helped, not solve, but help the problems we have today. One is strong file authentication. It should be possible when you send me a file over the internet, that when I get it, there's a way to assure that what you sent is what I got. It's not been changed, it's not been replaced, etc. We could have done that. There's also strong user authentication. How do you prove it's you? That would not have been that difficult at the time, but we didn't build on those technologies. Had we done that, the first thing we should have done was turn them off. There was no need for them. They would have been hard and in the way. And as some of the bad behavior began to arise, we could have turned them on slowly. They wouldn't have solved the problem, but they would have helped, and they would have created a mindset to recognize there are things coming in the future that may need protection. To introduce those security and privacy technologies now is very hard. We have a legacy system of billions of users. It's awfully hard to build in something now which is backward compatible to all the systems we have. So it's a terribly difficult task right now. We had a clean sheet of paper to begin with. We could have done a lot and we didn't. I'm sorry, you're about to go on, but I had to make that point.
no, that's well, it is harder now. I think there's a lot that you know, what I'm seeing in the chat, by the way, is folks really enjoyed this talk. They're already asking for Dr. Kleinrock Part 2. So maybe not too far in the future, we'd love to have you back as a guest on Tesla Unwired, as part of a panel with some of the other folks that were part of your team, and you know, they can start throwing out some challenges to folks to increase their netiquette. So I can't thank you enough for your time. This was illuminating for myself, for our team here at Tesla, and for everyone in the audience. And you know, really appreciate all that you've done, not only today, but throughout your career to change our lives. Thank you.
Mark, my pleasure. And by the way, we talked about those early days and where it all began. The room in which we started the internet is still there. It's set up to receive visitors. It's right at UCLA around the corner from my office. And people are welcome to access it virtually, or when the pandemic is done, come and visit. We also, that's the past, honoring the past. We've also got a new laboratory called the UCLA Connection Lab, which is where we see the future going. So we've coupled the past with the future, and there's a lot going on that we'd love to have some of you people access and connect to.
I think in Part 2, we have to do a virtual tour of both labs and then learn more about the future. That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely. My
Thank you so much.
pleasure. Thanks for having me.